It is my great honor to have been invited to share with you some of the Torah lessons of Hagaon Moreno Harav Lichtenstein Zatzal during this, the 10th year since his passing. Today's lesson is based on the opening portion of a chapter in Kedushat Aviv entitled Kiddush, in which Harav Lichtenstein seeks to define the nature of Kiddush that we recite on Shabbat and Yom Tov. And to begin the analysis, Rav Lichtenstein quotes from the Rambam in Ilchot Shabbat, Perek Chavtet Halacha Aleph, Mitzvat Aseh min Torah, Lekadesh et Yom HaShabbat b'Dvarim. It's a positive commandment from the Torah to sanctify the Shabbat day with words. Shenamar, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho. Because the Torah states, remember the Shabbat day to sanctify it. Klomar, Zochreu Zchirat Shevach v'Kiddush. Remember it with praise and sanctification. Notice those closing words of Zochreu Zchirat Shevach v'Kiddush, to remember Shabbat with Shevach, with praise and sanctification. A point that's strengthened via a somewhat unexpected source in the 7th chapter of Hilchot Chametz U'Matzah, where the Rambam makes a comparison between the obligation to tell the story, to remember Yitziat Mitzrayim, and the obligation we have to remember Shabbat. As he writes, Mitzvat Aseh shel Torah l'saper b'nisim v'haniflaot shena'asu l'avotenu b'Mitzrayim b'leil 15 b'Nisan. It's a positive commandment to recount the miracles and wonders performed for our ancestors in Mitzrayim on the night of the 15th of Nisan, Shenemar, Zachor et hayom hazeh asher yatzata Mitzrayim. As it's written, remember this day on which you came out of Egypt. Kimo shenemar, Zachor et yom HaShabbat lekadsho. Just as it's stated, remember the Shabbat day to sanctify it. Based on this comparison and knowing that the way we remember Yitziat Mitzrayim is via the mitzvah of retelling the story, Harav Lichtenstein explains that the way we remember Shabbat, Zochreu Zchirat Shevach v'Kiddush, is via Kiddush, where we have the opportunity, L'faer, L'shabeach, L'romem et hayom, to praise, glorify, and elevate the day with words. This understanding is even more obvious via a third source of the Rambam in his Sefer HaMitzvot, Mitzvat Aseh Kuf Nun Hey 155, where the Rambam writes, Shetzivanu lekadesh et HaShabbat v'lomar dvarim b'knisato v'tzeito, nizkor b'hem godel hayom hazeh u'malato v'hibadlo mishar hayamim hakodmim mimena v'abeim acharav. That he commanded us to sanctify the Shabbat and to say words at its beginning and at its end, in which we remember the greatness and exaltedness of this day and its distinction from the days that preceded it and those that follow it. V'hu amaro yitalem zachor et yom HaShabbat lekadsho. Klomar zochreu zecher kedusha gdula. And this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's statement. Exalted be He. Remember the Shabbat day to sanctify it. Meaning, remember it with a memory of holiness and greatness. Zachor et yom HaShabbat lekadsho. All three places talk about remembering with words. On the other hand, we find the Ramban, who first begins in a way that just is expanding the scope of this commandment to remember Shabbat. In Shmot, in Perek Chaf Pasuk Bet, following the Pshat, the Rambam explains that remembering Shabbat does not only refer to Shabbat itself, but rather to the entire week. He explains that this is a mitzvah, a commandment to constantly remember the Shabbat day throughout the week. Shelo nishkacheu v'lo yitchalef lanu b'shar hayamim, ki bezochrenu oto tamid yizkor maaseh bereshit b'chol eit, so that it's not forgotten or confused with other days. For through our constant remembrance of it, we shall always remember the work of creation. In other words, according to the Ramban, one can fulfill the mitzvah of Zachor, of remembering the Shabbat day even on a Sunday or a Monday or any other weekday, for each day of the week is an opportunity to recall the unique stature of Shabbat. But then the Ramban brings a midrashic teaching of Chazal, comparing the Kiddush of Shabbat to the Kiddush, the sanctification of the Yovel year, as he wrote, Aval Rabotenu od bo midrash mimilat lekadsho, shenekadshehu bezikaron, K'inyan v'kidashtem et shnat ha'chamishim shana. But our Chazal interpreted additionally from the word lekadsho, that refers to Shabbat, that we should also sanctify it through verbal declaration, as in the case of you shall sanctify the 50th year. Shu ta'un kiddush beidin lemor beyovel mekudash mekudash. Avkan tziva sheniskor et yom HaShabbat bekodshenu oto, which requires in the Yovel year that the Beit Din proclaims Mikudash, Mikudash, it's sanctified, sanctified is the Yovel year. So too, HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us to remember the Shabbat day by sanctifying it verbally, which is an astounding statement, because the Ramban's comparison of remembering Shabbat, of the Kiddush of Shabbat to the Kiddush of Yovel, implies that just as Beit Din creates the Kedusha of Yovel, and similar to the Kedusha of Rosh Chodesh, through the Beit Din's proclamation of Mikudash, Mikudash, so too do we sanctify Shabbat via the Kiddush we recite. This understanding of Kiddush is a radically different understanding from the Rambam. Kiddush is not merely shevach, as the Rambam would suggest, praise of something already holy, but rather, according to the Ramban, it is a ma'aseh yitzirah, a legal and creative act of infusing the day with humanly articulated sanctity, parallel to the Beit Din's role in declaring sacred times such as Yovel or Rosh Chodesh. Of course, the implication of this idea is far from simple and was addressed as well by Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal in one of his Yortzeit Sheirim. Asked Rav Lichtenstein, however, if we are to follow the understanding of the Ramban, how can you add sanctity to something that is already holy? After all, Shabbat is holy from the point of Maaseh Breshit. So how can our making Kiddush add to the Kedusha? And secondly, does the Jewish people even have a role in the sanctity of Shabbat? Isn't it entirely in the domain of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How can human beings be so presumptuous to imagine that we can add Kedusha from this earth, milamata, to something that is sacred, milamala? And yet, as Rav Lichtenstein would soon prove via two seemingly unrelated, but through the brilliance of Rav Lichtenstein, totally pertinent cases, there are multiple strata of Kedusha. And it's possible to add a human dimension of Kedusha to a Kedusha of divine origin, thereby understanding the position of the Ramban. The first proof that Rav Lichtenstein offered is via the law of the Bechor, of the firstborn animal. And the second proof will come from the process of Kiddush HaChodesh, sanctifying the new month. The first proof is from the law of the firstborn animal. We know that a Bechor, a firstborn, is seemingly something that is sanctified, mikudash, from the womb, which creates a problem in the laws of nedarim, of vows. When a person makes a neder, there's a well-known principle that one may only sanctify something by referencing another item that is already sanctified through a neder, as in, I now sanctify this loaf of bread just as I sanctified that other item. This method is called hatpasa, transference by association. The question is, can one take a vow through atpasa using a firstborn animal? The Gemara Nedarim and Daf Yud Bet Amud Bet teaches that according to Rabbi Yehuda, one cannot attach a vow via hatpasa to a firstborn. One can't say, I sanctify this item just like a firstborn, because that firstborn had sanctity not via a neder, but a sanctity imposed automatically by the Torah. And even though there's a mitzvah to sanctify the firstborn animal, that sanctification, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is the reason the animal is sacred. Instead, it's sacred mishamaya, from the heavens, once it was conceived. But then comes Rabbi Yaakov, who says that even a firstborn can be the basis for hatpasa, for it too is considered vowed. In other words, there's an automatic sanctity in the firstborn, but there's also a mitzvah that we must actively sanctify it, not merely that it be holy from the womb. And that's the way we rule, according to Rabbi Yaakov, that human sanctification does add to the Kedusha of divine sanctification, just as the Ramban wrote that our Kiddush adds to the Kedusha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's already sacred Shabbat. And Rav Lichtenstein's second proof for the Ramban comes from the case of Kiddush HaChodesh, of sanctifying the new month, which, while also divinely structured, depends upon human testimony and human sanctification. In the process of declaring a new month, we always wait for witnesses to come on the 30th day of the month, even allowing those witnesses to be Mechalel Shabbat in order to arrive on time and give their testimony about seeing the new moon. But what happens if they didn't come on the 30th day? Undoubtedly, the 31st day will be declared the first day of the new month, about which there is no doubt, because by then the new month has to start. But is it permitted for the witnesses to desecrate Shabbat, to be Mechalel Shabbat on the 31st day, and arrive in Yerushalayim in order to deliver their testimony? The answer is that it is permitted to be Mechalel Shabbat for the sake of a new moon testimony, even when it's not in its proper time, even on the 31st day. But why? What's the underlying rationale that would permit Chilul Shabbat for the sanctifying the month that will be established automatically anyways? We know that 31st day has to be the first day of the next month. So why would we allow the Eidim to come via some form of Chilul Shabbat to give testimony about something that's automatic? Rav Lichtenstein proposed two possible explanations. The first is that perhaps what overrides Shabbat is the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh to sanctify the month, and not merely the etzem kviat Rosh Chodesh, the need to determine its date. Or two, perhaps we can distinguish between two separate functions. There's one aspect of determining the date of Rosh Chodesh, and there's another to impose sanctity upon the new moon. Lo re'i Rosh Chodesh kidshu shamayim ki re'i Rosh Chodesh nitkadesh b'yedei beit din al smach edutam. And there is a qualitative difference between a month sanctified simply by God versus one sanctified by Beit Din via witnesses. And that, said Rav Lichtenstein, is what permits the Chilul Shabbat. In other words, and as seen with the issue of the firstborn, there is a precedent for human beings adding holiness to what is already holy. And this becomes a foundation for reinterpreting Kiddush, not just as praise, as the Rambam had suggested, but as the Ramban wants to explain, as a human act of sanctification, and that Am Yisrael has the ability and even the responsibility to partner with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and infuse an added stratum of Kedushat to Shabbat via our Kiddush on Shabbat. This, too, may explain an unusual statement in the Yerushalmi in a series of psukim in Vayikra. The Yerushalmi in Brachot discusses the situation where the Shaliach Tzibur on Friday night doesn't have wine for Kiddush. In that case, suggests the Yerushalmi, it says that the Bracha Me'in Sheva should conclude with the words Mekadesh Yisrael v'Yom HaShabbat, similar to the formulation we'll use on a Yom Tov when we say Mekadesh Yisrael. We begin with the idea that the Jewish people are the ones who are creating sanctification. And while we don't rule that way, Rav Lichtenstein suggested that this too may be the result of the idea that ultimately our Kiddush does add that stratum of Kedusha to Shabbat itself. And that's why the Yerushalmi had that special bracha beginning with Mekadesh Yisrael, with the fact that the Jewish people are going to sanctify Shabbat, which may be another reason why the section of Moadot in Parashat Emor in Vayikra begins with Shabbat, because Shabbat does possess a requirement of Kedusha similar to the holidays, that when we make Kiddush, we're adding to the Kedusha of Shabbat just as the holidays rely on Klal Yisrael to sanctify them. And so even though it seems as if Shabbat is out of place in the beginning of Emor, Shabbat shares that very feature with the other Yom Tovim based on the Ramban's understanding. And while there's so much more to Rav Lichtenstein's shir and to the thesis and to this chapter, allow me to conclude with one nafkamina, one halachic ramification that flows from the two fundamental understandings of Kiddush. Is there a mitzvah of Kiddush and Yom Tov? And if so, is it midioraita, a Torah-level obligation, or midirabanan, a rabbinic one? On Shabbat, Kiddush, without a doubt, is a Torah obligation. The Gemara in Brachot and Daf Chaf Amud Bet lists the positive time-bound commandments that women are obligated in, and one of them is Kiddush. Because despite the general exemption of women from time-bound mitzvot, from mitzvot aseh shazman grama, kol sheyeshno b'shmira yeshno b'schira, whoever is included in the prohibition of guarding the Shabbat, whoever is prohibited from the various melachot is also included in remembering Shabbat, which is Kiddush. But what about Yom Tov? Is Kiddush and Yom Tov also Torah mandated? Regarding the Rambam's position, there's a dispute. The Maggid Mishnah claims that the Rambam would hold that Kiddush and Yom Tov is only rabbinic. However, from the simple reading of the Rambam's words, as Rav Lichtenstein argues, it emerges that Kiddush and Yom Tov is also a Torah obligation. The Rambam in Hilchot Shabbat, in Perek Chavtet Halacha Yud Aleph, teaches Kishem shemekadeshim b'leilei Shabbat umavdilin b'motzei Shabbat kach mekadeshin b'leilei Yamim Tovim umavdilin b'motzaam. That just as we sanctify the night on Shabbat and make Havdalah, and so too we sanctify the nights of Yom Tov and recite Havdalah at their conclusion. And the plain sense of these words creates a clear equivalence between Shabbat and Yom Tov with respect to Kiddush. This is also the position of the Sheiltot, that Kiddush and Shabbat and Yom Tov are both midioraita, Torah obligations. However, there's an interesting difference in the source of the law of Kiddush and Shabbat and Yom Tov between the Rambam and the Sheiltot. The Rambam understands and states explicitly at the end of his ruling, Shekulam Shabbatot Hashemim, that they're all Sabbaths of the Lord. And that is, the obligation of Kiddush stems from a shared sanctity of the day, whether Shabbat or Yom Tov. According to the Rambam's consistent view, Kiddush is the recitation of words of praise, of Shevach to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for the sanctity of Shabbat, and by extension, and because of this comparison, also for the sanctity of Yom Tov. However, the Sheiltot maintains that on Shabbat, the source of Kiddush, being the Oraita, is based on Zachor Yom HaShabbat Lekadosho, remember the Shabbat day to sanctify it, while on Yom Tov, he has a totally different source. The source is a different pasuk from Vayikra Chaf Gimel Mikra'ei Kodesh, that it's considered a holy convocation, and according to the Sheiltot, perhaps he adopts the position of the Ramban, that on Shabbat, Kiddush entails an act of imposing sanctity on the day, whereas in Yom Tov, no such sanctity is imposed by the individual. Our Kiddush doesn't bring more Kedusha because the Beit Din has already sanctified it. After all, the Yom Tov, the Beit Din did their job, and it was invoked in that blessing, Mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim. That distinction between the Sheiltot and the Rambam, and the understanding of the Ramban's role of Kiddush, makes this idea clear on whether Kiddush on Yom Tov or on Shabbat are the same or in some ways differ. And that is just the beginning of the brilliance of Harav Lichtenstein, who we miss so dearly, and from whom we continue to learn via his Sfarim and his Talmidim. And we pray not only that his neshama will continue to have an aliyah, but that we will continue to be a nachat ruach through our learning and our actions to all that Rav Lichtenstein taught us and our entire world.